If you listen to the first episode, Who Killed Gail and Cater, then you already know the kind of stories that we're going to tell here. Today's episode might just be a little bit different. The case you're about to hear about was once cold, but it has since been solved. While it may not carry the same unanswered tensions, it holds something just as important: the truth. And more importantly, it's the foundation of everything that follows. There are more cases coming, cases that are intense, complicated, still waiting for answers. But before we get there, you need to understand how all this started, why I'm telling these stories in the first place. Most people grow up with a story about where they come from. For some, that's simple. For others, it's anything but. Mine started with a question that I didn't even know I was asking. A question that stayed quiet until it didn't. Because once I started looking, things began to surface, things I was never supposed to find. It pulled me into an investigation that I never expected to be a part of. It led me to my father, and that led me to an attack on my mother. And this is where it all began.
Walking proof.
Shampoo and PJ.
Walking proof.
Tell me what you know. Shampoo PJ. Take me down that road.
Walking proof.
Truth in the dark. Oh, tell me now.
Walking proof.
Leave a mark.
Welcome to Walking Proof.
A true crime podcast with PJ and Shan Paul. I'm Joseph Bales, your co-host, also known as PJ.
And I'm Shannon Bales, your host and the author of Walking Proof. I'm also known as Shan Paul.
So, Shannon, this is our second episode, and if anyone missed the first trailer, I really encourage you to go back and listen to it. It gives you a little insight into who we are and why we do this. And this episode that we're putting out today, it matters so much because it is more than just how you found your biological father. It is about how the whole story began. And I have to tell you, Shannon, your story, it's amazing. The twist, the turns in your life are really, it's just wild. So wild, you actually wrote a book about it.
I did. And even if you've read that book, you might hear a different perspective today, maybe even a few things that I didn't include. And if you haven't read it yet, you can find it on Amazon, Walking Proof by Shannon Manley Bales.
So before we get into today's episode, I think it would be good to clarify why this episode is even being aired. And the reason I say that is because you already wrote a book that completely tells your mother's story in intricate detail.
If you want to understand the research, the cases, the obsessions, the questions that followed me for years, we need to start here. And before I go any further, I do want to address something personal. I know that there are people out there that feel that I shouldn't share such deeply personal things about my birth mother, especially the trauma that she went through. At first, that sounds legitimate. It sounded legitimate to me. After talking it over with my counselor, thinking about it, I've realized something important about sharing her story.
For years, Shannon, there's been a narrative about your birth mother.
Right.
And that narrative was she was a homeless woman who had 7 children and she abandoned them all. And that narrative sort of kind of paints her as irresponsible. And it also makes it sound like she lacked human emotion.
Yeah. I've even heard people say that it was drugs and alcohol that caused her problems. And that part is just completely untrue. She did have the 7 children, but the drugs and alcohol did not play a part.
When people find parts of a story that are missing, they tend to fill in the blanks with assumptions or just make up whatever fits the narrative they want it fit.
Right. What I know now is that my mother is a strong woman and she's fought battles that many of us would never fully understand. She has endured trauma that has shifted her reality for most of her life. And by telling her story, it's not out of disrespect. I am trying to preserve her memory and her legacy because she was not the woman who was portrayed to me.
You know, I met Sybil almost 17 years ago now when I met you, and that was back in 2009. I didn't know Sybil prior to 2009, but I do have an almost 2-decade history of knowing her now. And because of the trauma she survived, her mental illness, the homelessness, perceptions of her could have been greatly misconstrued.
Yeah, that's very true. She is a loving woman. And this part's important to me because most of her children didn't really know her. And her children, her grandchildren, the generations that come after us, they deserve to to know the truth.
Absolutely. You know, this segment of your journey began back in 2009. Actually, the first chapter of your book is called The Christmas Gift. And one of the reasons that we're so excited about today's episode is because we have a very special guest with us, my mother, whom everyone calls Callie.
Yes, I am very excited. And now I know you said your mother, and now that's by technicality, that's true. But I think after almost 17 years, 17 years next month, I think it's safe to say that it's our mother.
100%. And I couldn't be happier that you two are so close. You know, together, you have researched DNA with her, genealogy, cold cases. And now that I'm retired, you both have turned me into a full on true crime genetic genealogist.
Callie gave me the DNA kit for Christmas. At the time, it felt like a curious gift, something interesting, something that I could use to learn more about who I thought my family was. And I had no idea that that gift was going to would uncover the foundation of everything that I would spend years trying to understand. So I am happy to introduce everyone to Carolyn Bales. Let's welcome our favorite lady, Callie.
Ah, thank you. I feel so honored to be your very first guest.
Well, it's only fitting that you are our first guest because you're the one who started all this. You're the one who gave Shannon that DNA kit back in 2009.
Well, at that particular time, I had no idea what that gift would uncover. Looking back now, it has just become mind boggling.
Yes, it has. So, Mother, let's go back to Christmas 2009. You know, Shannon was very new to the family at that time, and we had just started dating. What made you decide to buy the DNA kit for Shannon in the first place?
Well, he had mentioned a family called Stockstill that lived in our community when you were growing up. And I didn't know very much about the Stockstill. But I also understood that Shannon didn't know very much about his background, who he was, where he came from, etc. So I labored over the Christmas gift. I asked you, do you think a DNA kit would be okay for Christmas? And you said, Mother, whatever you think.
Right.
That's interesting. I had actually forgotten that I had asked you about the Stockstill family that was there in Louisiana. But now that you're saying it, it's all coming back. At the time, I was just trying to understand more about who my biological father was. He was a Stockstill, a man that my mother was married to for a very brief time.
You know, you really didn't know much about him. You told me you had only met him once in your entire life, so you didn't know anything about your father's side of the family.
That's correct. I only remember meeting him once in person, and that was as an adult, although I've been told that he was around when I was an infant.
Well, also, with your growing interest in genealogy, I just felt like it was important for you to know more about your family.
Oh, I definitely learned more about my family.
Yes, you
You did,
did.
Shannon. Shannon, you really didn't know much about your father, Jimmy Stockstill. I remember when we met, I asked you normal questions that come up when people meet, and that usually includes, asking about somebody's family.
Right, right. And I had very little information about that man, Jimmy. Um, or his family at all. I knew that he and my mother had been briefly married just a few months in 1978. They actually divorced before I was ever conceived. I knew that he had spent time in prison, and beyond that, I didn't really know a whole lot.
So, Shannon, you just said that Jimmy Stockstill and your birth mother, Sybil, were divorced before you were conceived.
Right.
So, since you knew that information, there were some reasons that you continued to think that Jimmy could have been your father.
You know, I had been told all my life that Jimmy Stockstill was my father. I had also been told that their relationship was on again, off again. And even after the divorce, he was around when I was born. So it was easy for me to sort of believe that narrative that he was my father. As a matter of fact, when my adopted mom took me in at 2 weeks old, my mom always told the story that he and my birth mother showed up at my Aunt Nettie's house just asking to babysit, and they just never came back.
Right. So, you really didn't know a lot about Jimmy, and that included his family, his siblings, his parents, basically anybody else in his family tree.
I really didn't. So, you know me, I began searching. This research bug was in me even as a child. I think I was like a preteen. I wasn't even quite 10, 11. And I opened up the phone book and I called every single Stockstell that I could find, trying to piece together, a family that I barely knew. Eventually, I reached his parents, who I believed were my grandparents.
Mercy. As a grandparent, I can't even begin to imagine getting a call like that from a child. I am trying to think about how I would respond if I had a call from a young child and they were saying that I could be their grandmother. I remember you telling us they responded to your call.
Right. Well, one of them was not exactly welcoming. The first man I reached was abrupt and dismissive. He even hung up on me.
Actually, he didn't hang up on you till he gave you a few choice words.
Right. Later, I learned that that was actually Jimmy's father. And he and Jimmy were estranged at the time. So there was a lot of tension when this child was calling. But a few calls later, I reached Jimmy's mother, and that was a different call. She was kind, she was receptive. She did tell me that she told me that she felt like there was no way that Jimmy could be my biological father. So I wasn't completely sure how to process that, if, that was just a way of avoiding the truth, or if she knew that he could not be my father.
I don't think this is a spoiler right here because it's central to your story.
Right.
But your book really dives into discovering that you were the product of a very violent attack. And at that time, I think you might have had an idea that Jimmy might not be your father.
Yeah. So maybe yes, maybe no. I think my mind chose to believe a version of the story that I had been told. I had also heard that my birth mother had been sexually assaulted and that I could have been a result of that attack. At the same time, I had found Jimmy Stockstill on the sex offender list. So in my mind, I sort of created this domestic violence type situation that's what the rumors were about. And so I thought maybe that could explain the story that didn't quite make sense. So looking back, I can see how much that I was trying to force a version of the truth that I could live with. And I did that for a long time.
We were living in Bryan, Texas in 2011, and that's the year I met Jimmy as well.
You did. You did. And that's a whole story in itself. I truly believe that he was my father. I even had a deathbed confession. Jimmy told me that he always knew that I could be a son and that my mother would have come after him for child support. So that was his justification for not being around. Years before that, I he even tried to track down one of his sons to do a DNA test. This was in the early days of the internet. Looking back, I'm pretty sure that was scammed. That's a long story in itself. I truly believe that he was my father at that time.
I remember that, and he even made you his medical power of attorney, someone you had only met once when he became ill and was dying. And at that time, he only reached out to you and to your half sister.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story. He had a daughter that was born in Mexico that was under very complicated circumstances.
For anyone who is interested in more of those details, they are in Shannon's book, Walking Proof. So, Shannon, in your book, you talk about warning signs. I think there were times that you thought that Jimmy might not have been your father. Actually, I think there were some warning signs all along the way.
There were things that were said in anger, things whispered like in family conversations. My adopted mom, the mom who raised me, had a temper. She said some horrible things at times. For example, you're going to end up just like your father in prison, or you're going to end up being a violent criminal. I am downplaying the way it was said, but it was a lot racier than that. As a teenager, I remember reading my aunt's diary, something I should not have done, but as a teenager, I was drawn, that curiosity about the past, so I'd get lost in her diaries. Something I shouldn't have done, I wanna acknowledge that, but there was a line that I remember reading, it said, "I sure hope that Jimmy is the father and not the men who raped her."
Shannon, I also remember you talking about an incident at Casa Ole.
Yeah, so I was a teenager at this time, and I had taken my birth mother, Sybil, to Casa Lane. We were eating, and I noticed her getting uncomfortable, and her like psychosis was kicking in. She threw salsa at me. She started screaming, disorganized thoughts, and everything that was happening in that schizophrenic moment. She said, "You look just like the bastard who raped me." You know, when I questioned whether Jimmy was my father, some family members just told me to stop looking. But the more people told me to stop, the more I needed to know. So, yes, looking back, there were warning signs,
There were, but let's go back to that DNA test. You received it as a Christmas gift from mother, from Callie.
right?
You took the test, you mailed it off, and we were all excited about getting those results back and finding some answers about your family. I can only imagine what was going through your mind while you were waiting on those results.
Well, when the DNA results finally came back in, I was a bit nervous, but I really wasn't expecting a shock. Not at first. I already believed I knew who my birth father was. After all, I had a deathbed confession,
Right.
so I didn't have any reason to doubt that there would be any mystery.
I remember when your results came in, you called me trying to make sense out of them.
Yes, I definitely was trying to make sense of it all. One important piece of information here is that this was in the early days of genetic genealogy. Back then, we didn't have all the tools that we have today. There were only a few thousand people who had tested, not millions like it is today. And we didn't even have Autosomble to work with like we do today. It was pretty limited.
Yes, that's correct. We went through family tree DNA, and all we had to work with was mtDNA and y-DNA.
So, Callie, for anyone out there who may not be familiar with those terms, Y-DNA traces the paternal line and mtDNA traces the maternal line.
Correct.
So, see, you and Shannon have taught me a few things.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And that part is kind of important to this whole story because my Y DNA was extremely rare. I only had a handful of matches out of all the people in the world. I had one exact match on 37 markers, but none of the names were making sense to me though.
I remember you calling saying that you didn't see any Stockstill name anywhere. I
Yeah,
couldn't find one either.
right. Yeah, I didn't see any stock stills. All I saw was the last name Williams and the last name Dixon. And I was just kind of staring at the results on the screen, trying to make sense of it, trying to make it fit. Wanted it to mean that maybe Jimmy was still connected. Maybe, I wanted the story to hold together.
That was so confusing because I think we all thought at the time Jimmy Stockstill was your father. And now you started to think maybe he wasn't your father. So I think you started having some doubts.
I probably should have had some doubts, but actually not really. I sort of ignored what I was seeing. I explained it away. I told myself, Jimmy was probably not a biological stock still. Maybe his father wasn't his father. So I was trying to find another explanation.
There was a moment though when things did begin to shift and you really started seeing everything very differently.
Absolutely. I started asking questions and I reached out to a cousin. That cousin confirmed more details about the rumor of the attack. She even encouraged me to start looking in pointing me in the right direction to some medical reports and police reports. And then I started to kind of look at my DNA results maybe a little differently.
You know, Shannon, I remember that time very clearly. The research, the emotions, it didn't all come together overnight.
Not at all. And it was about that time. Remember earlier, I talked about having a half sister. Jimmy Stockstill had a daughter in Mexico under complicated circumstances. She reached out to me. Jessica was dealing with immigration issues, needed to prove that her biological father was a U.S. citizen. Her attorney suggested that we should do a DNA test. That DNA test is what really kind of shifted everything. The results did confirm through a process of elimination that Jimmy Stockstill was not my father.
It actually, yes, it actually confirmed that Jimmy was her
Her
father
father, right, and not
and
mine.
not your father. And I remember that's when the questions came back up again. The real big question, if Jimmy wasn't your father, then who was?
Yeah, and that's when the real search began.
For sure. This is where the story really takes a lot of twists and turns for you because you began to hunt and do a diligent search for your father. This was a father you knew nothing about. At this point, your father and his family was just like a blank slate. You were literally starting all over from scratch.
It really was. I went back to the DNA results and I began building family trees from the ground up. The names Williams and Dixon was all I had. So from there, I started tracing branches, connecting family lines, narrowed things down to the Williams family from Evergreen, Alabama. I reached out to a family member that I had never met, knowing only that we were connected within a few generations through Y-DNA. Slowly, piece by piece, I began identifying people in that line, and I eventually focused on one man, Douglas Lamar Williams.
You know, I remember when you started to really believe that Doug was your father, you found a phone number and you called him.
I did. And when I contacted him, he denied that he could be my father. He said that it was impossible. He was in prison at the time of my conception, and but he still wanted to have a conversation. And ironically, he still wanted to meet.
He did. I definitely remember that meeting. Both of us, especially you, had lots of emotions going on. I mean, we were excited to meet the first person on your biological father's side, whether this turned out to be a father, an uncle, maybe a cousin, at least it was someone with whom you actually shared DNA, the first living relative on your biological father's side.
Right. I was very nervous that day going into that meeting. I had already found, Doug on the sex offender registry. I knew that he was connected to crimes. I knew he was a stranger to me. I did not know what kind of person or what I was getting myself into. I didn't know what he might do if he felt cornered.
Exactly. And it was certainly an emotional day for you. We met at a small taqueria in Houston. I mean, he walked into the restaurant wearing sandals, white socks, shorts, and a white t-shirt. It was just such an ordinary looking moment for something so life changing. And even then, at the end of that luncheon, even then you had no scientific proof yet. But I feel like that we both felt that we had just had lunch with your biological father.
Yeah. So there are moments that intuition sometimes is louder than logic. Even though he had told me that he had been incarcerated around the time of my conception, that was impossible. This was one of those moments that my intuition was telling me uh, that it had to be him. He denied it. There were still slips along the way, small things that didn't quite fit, things that made it clear that he was not telling me everything. When, we left that meeting, I knew I was getting closer, and I knew we were getting closer to the truth. And the truth was becoming more darker than I had imagined.
That is so very true. I think the truths unveiled because of that one DNA test were much darker than any of us could have ever imagined. And I think it's important that, we say this because it literally shaped how you viewed everything moving forward.
It really did. And when we talk about suspects, especially in cases like this, we tend to picture someone who's obvious, someone who's reckless, someone who looks like what we expect a serial predator like that to look like. But the truth is, that's not always how it works. Even when I think about my own biological father, he was not the kind of person that you would immediately assume was capable of violent crimes. He wasn't loud. He wasn't chaotic. He didn't draw attention to himself.
You know, that's a really interesting observation, and you are absolutely correct. I think, if anything, Doug was the kind of person who just could move quietly. He could simply blend in, and as we say sometimes, he could just fly under the radar.
Oh, absolutely. You know, it was almost as if he was invisible. I talked to his family, even his own family, like his siblings and his nephews and nieces. They knew that he had a criminal history, but like basic theft, just an ordinary criminal. And it kind of got me to thinking about the Texas killing fields and what happened to my mother. It kind of raises a bigger question. Was whoever was responsible for the Texas killing field, was it one person or multiple individuals or a handful of men using the Houston I-45 area, moving in and out without ever being noticed? Because in that case, then we're not just looking at an obvious suspect. It would be someone like my father. We would be looking for people who knew how to disappear into everyday life, people who know how to cover their tracks, people who did not raise suspicion.
Exactly. And I remember coming home after that meeting with Doug. You dove headlong back into your research. I mean, you had a dry erase board set up in the bedroom and you were constantly writing notes all over it, connecting names, trying to make sense of every piece of the puzzle. And then you started looking more closely at your mother's attack, back to that Monday, October 30th, 1978, when your mother was brutally assaulted and left for dead.
Yeah, that night changed the course of her entire life. I was able to obtain the medical records that included the graphic details of what happened to her. I'm not going to repeat every detail here.
There's so many details there, Shannon. And let's talk about part of her story because, sometimes it's difficult to understand until you take a hard look at that particular point in time. You know, in that era back then, and even still lingering today, there was and there still is a significant stigma around mental health. And because of that, victims, especially women who were struggling or even institutionalized, they they were just often not taken as seriously as they should have been.
I've had the question asked often, especially with this last episode about Gail, you know, why didn't they look into my mother's attack more? And in my mother's case, that stigma of mental health played a role in how everything was handled. It appears that her story was not fully investigated. It doesn't appear that it was properly documented in the way that you would expect, crimes of that magnitude to be documented. Instead, I didn't find one complete record. I had to piece it together myself.
So I can tell you one thing. You did an excellent job putting the pieces of this puzzle into place. I mean, from your aunt's diary, from the hospital records at Jeff Davis, from a court order committing your mother, from discharge papers from Austin State Hospital. I mean, just from stories that your family passed down to you.
Yeah. Each piece told part of the story, but not one piece had everything. I had to pull it all together. And that meant that the truth sat in fragments for decades.
They really did, Shannon. And we have both read those reports, and they are graphically detailed. So what I will say is that she was violently beaten. There were a list of injuries in the records, multiple contusions, prolonged assault, internal trauma.
Yeah, she was beaten unconscious, left for dead. She had broken ribs, fractured cheekbones.
She was brutally assaulted by 3 men, and the damage didn't end with just that night. The results of that assault sent her to the hospital for months, and it was there that she was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic.
The most tragic part is I was never able to actually find a documented police report. Buried in the medical record was a reference to the incident report.
You know, and a few weeks later, she was given a pregnancy test. It was positive. She was carrying you, a direct result of that attack.
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to process. And the fact that there were 3 men who assaulted her that simply disappeared into the night, never captured, never brought to justice, it's still something that I think about.
You know, Shannon, it was very unfortunate that your birth mom, Sybil, never received the justice she deserved. But because of your diligence, your extensive research, genetic genealogy, her case was solved.
That is correct. Not through the legal system, but through genetic genealogy. And eventually, after years of refusing, Doug finally agreed to do a paternity test in 2020. The statute of limitation was up. There was nothing that I could do to him. But when those results came back, I confirmed what I already knew, that Douglas Lamar Williams was my biological father.
And Shannon, that's the moment that you learned the brutal truth. You became the walking proof that connected your biological father, Douglas Lamar Williams, to the crime and attack against your birth mother, Sybil Ray Tennyson Stevens.
And just a few seconds ago, I said I may not have, because of the statute of limitation, got legal justice, but by being able to hold him accountable and him looking me in the eye and him knowing that I knew the truth, that is a sense of justice. I'm not just telling you what happened to me, I'm telling you what happened to her. And that's what my book was about. And that's what this podcast, or at least this episode specifically, is about. I couldn't tell the story and all the other stories to come without starting here, because once my mother's story was finally seen clearly, it sort of changed everything. It changed how I understood my own life, changed how I understood my family. It changed how I looked at the cases that I researched.
And Shannon, that is something I have seen you carry into every case you uncover. Because, the reality is, in these cases, the truth is never really missing. It's just buried in pieces, just waiting for someone to come along and connect them all.
Yeah. I soon realized that my mother's attack was not the only crime that Doug committed. Something that I probably need to clarify that I didn't say earlier is that I 100% confirmed that Doug was not in prison like he claimed,
Right?
when the attack on my mother happened. As a matter of fact, 2 months after my mother's attack, he was involved in sexual assault in Freeport, Texas. The date was December 23rd, 1978. At first, it seemed like an isolated event, maybe random. But when I began to look at the bigger picture, it suggested that there was something far more disturbing. Pattern, a trail, story with layers that were hidden for far too long.
So next week, we will take a closer look at that case, which is actually several cases in one. And there are several twists in that case. And I am looking forward to those cases airing. Again, it was great to have our first guest,
Yes.
Callie, with us today.
Yay.
Thanks so much for inviting and including me. I feel honored to be your first guest,
Oh.
and I feel more honored that I had sense enough to get you that DNA
Yeah.
kit. It's been quite a journey, which I have followed all these 16 years. It's been wild.
Oh.
Yes, it has. So thanks again, and we'll see you all next week.
All right. Y'all have a great weekend.